In the quiet, climate-controlled corridors of county morgues across the country, behind heavy, silent doors of stainless steel, a profound and hidden story is unfolding. There are individuals here who have been waiting for their final journey, not for days or even weeks, but in some cases, for more than a year. This long, cold wait is not for forensic answers, nor is it because their identity is a mystery. It is for a reason that is at once simple and devastatingly complex. Their families, the people who love them, cannot afford to lay them to rest. The final act of care has been priced out of reach. Before we start, a quick roll call. Write in the comments which part of this planet you're watching from, and then just listen and enjoy. This growing, silent accumulation of the dead in our public institutions forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. What does it mean for a society when the basic dignity of a final resting place becomes a luxury good? Over the course of our time together, we will explore this unseen crisis from every possible angle. We will walk through the crowded spaces of public morgues. We will listen to the stories of families caught in a state of financial and emotional limbo. And we will uncover how the modern business of death has led us to this very moment. By the end, you will understand not just the mechanics of this problem, but what it reveals about the values we hold, the communities we've built, and the ways in which we might find our way back to a more compassionate farewell. This is the story of the long wait. Imagine a space, meticulously clean and ordered, designed for temporary passage. It is a waypoint, a brief stop between the end of a life and the beginning of a memory. Yet, for thousands, this sterile environment has become a long-term residence. This is not a story of sensational neglect, but one of systemic economic paralysis. The staff here, the medical examiners, the technicians, the administrators, have become unintentional custodians. They are the keepers of stories that have no final chapter written. They see the names on the tags day after day, week after week. They know the files, and they often speak with the families who call. Their voices, a fragile mix of hope and shame, asking if they can just have one more week, just a little more time to find the money. It is crucial to understand that these are not the nameless or the forgotten. The term unclaimed, which is often used, feels cold and deeply misleading, as if it implies a lack of love or connection. But the truth is often the very opposite. The long wait is a testament to a family's desperate, quiet struggle. It is a silent, agonizing vigil against the final, anonymous disposition offered by the state. The body waits in the cold precisely because the family is trying, against overwhelming odds, to honor a life with the warmth of ritual and remembrance. They are not abandoning their loved one. They are fighting for them, even in death, against a system that has made that fight almost impossible to win. This period of waiting constitutes a unique form of modern limbo. It is a space between life and memory, between physical presence and profound absence. For the living, the grieving process is effectively frozen. How can you truly begin to mourn, to process a loss, when the physical form of the person you love is still present, held in a state of suspended animation by an invoice they cannot pay? The rituals that have guided humanity for millennia, the gathering of community, the sharing of stories, the committal of the body to the earth or to the flames, are all locked behind a financial gate. This is a grief that cannot flow. It is dammed up by phone calls to funeral homes, by rejected loan applications, and by the slow, crushing realization that the cost of a dignified goodbye is more than they have, or perhaps more than they have ever had. The ability to publicly mourn, to create a focal point for collective sorrow and celebration, is denied. The silence in these refrigerated rooms is different from the silence of a cemetery or a memorial. It is not a silence of peace or finality. It is the silence of a question that has not been answered, a journey that has not been completed, a promise that has not yet been fulfilled. And this is where the story broadens, touching all of us. This quiet crisis in our morgues is not merely about the funeral industry or its costs. It is a powerful, undeniable reflection of a much larger story about our collective economic fragility. It speaks volumes about a world where, for so many, there is no safety net. It's about how, in societies of once unimaginable wealth, the most fundamental human decencies, shelter, healthcare, and now, even a simple burial, can become terrifyingly inaccessible. The long wait is a symptom of a reality where the cost of living has relentlessly outpaced the ability to live. And now, it has begun to outpace the ability to die with a measure of grace. It's a chilling paradox that the very last act of care we can provide, the one we extend to those who can no longer ask for it, is the one that can financially ruin the living who are left behind. What is happening in these unseen spaces is a form of social record keeping. Each individual held in this state represents a story of economic hardship, a family struggling under the weight of a system that offers little support when they are at their most vulnerable. This is not a problem confined to the margins. It is creeping steadily into the mainstream, affecting working families, the elderly, and anyone for whom an unexpected multi-thousand-dollar expense would be a catastrophe. This silent accumulation of our dead is a relatively recent phenomenon, a rising tide that our public services are struggling to contain. The numbers, as we will soon see, tell a story that is both shocking and deeply revealing of the fractures in our social contract. As we move forward, we will begin to look at the sheer scale of this unseen overload, to understand just how many are waiting, for how long, and why this quiet, heartbreaking crisis is growing louder with each passing year. The long wait we spoke of is not an isolated story, a rare and tragic anomaly. It is a quiet, creeping epidemic. To truly grasp the gravity of this situation, we must step back from the individual story and look at the staggering scale of this unseen overload. The figures, when you gather them, paint a stark and deeply troubling picture. In major metropolitan areas, the numbers are climbing at a rate that public systems were never designed to handle. Consider a city like Los Angeles, where the county morgue has seen the number of bodies left in its care for extended periods more than double over the past decade. Or look to Cook County, which includes Chicago, where officials have had to lease additional refrigerated trailers, the kind you see used in mass casualty events, simply to manage the overflow of the deceased whose families cannot afford to claim them. These are not temporary measures for a specific crisis. They have become a semi-permanent, grim feature of the landscape of public death care. This pattern repeats itself across the nation, from New York to Maricopa County in Arizona. What was once a few dozen cases a year has become hundreds and in some places, thousands. The term unclaimed now describes a population the size of a small town, all held in a state of indefinite waiting. The duration of this wait is just as alarming as the numbers. Historically, a body might remain with a medical examiner for a week or two, perhaps a month in a complicated case involving identification. Today, the average time for these financially stranded individuals can stretch to 3, 4, even 6 months. And as we mentioned, cases extending beyond a year are no longer unheard of. Imagine the logistical strain this imposes. These facilities are built for high turnover, for a constant and respectful flow of individuals moving from clinical examination to the care of a funeral home. They are not warehouses. Yet, that is what they are being forced to become. The hum of the refrigeration units is a constant, expensive drone. The administrative burden is immense, involving a labyrinth of paperwork, repeated calls to distressed families, and the careful, meticulous tracking of each individual to ensure they are never lost in the system. Space, the most basic commodity, becomes a precious resource. When the designated coolers are full, coroners and medical examiners face impossible choices. This is the unseen, day-to-day reality of the overload, a system quietly buckling under a weight it was never meant to bear, managed by public servants who have become the default, long-term custodians for our society's most vulnerable dead. So, what is driving this surge? Why now? The answer is not a mystery. It lies in the economic realities that have defined the past 2 decades for a vast portion of the population. We can draw a direct, undeniable line from the rising numbers in our morgues to the rising cost of living and the persistent stagnation of wages. Think of it this way. For millions of families, the financial cushion that once existed, however thin, has been completely worn away. Decades ago, a working family might have had a small savings account, a bit of buffer for emergencies. Today, after years of inflation on essentials like housing, food, healthcare, and fuel, that buffer is gone. More than half of all households have less than $1,000 in savings. Many have none at all. They are living paycheck to paycheck, one unexpected expense away from a financial crisis. A major car repair is a disaster. A medical bill is a catastrophe. And a sudden death, with its accompanying price tag of $7,000, $10,000, or even $15,000, is a financial impossibility. The spike in unclaimed remains directly mirrors our growing economic precarity. It is a lagging indicator of our collective financial health. The pandemic, of course, exacerbated this crisis, stripping away jobs and savings while bringing a wave of unexpected death. But the trend was already well established, a slow-motion disaster building for years. We are witnessing the result of a society where the cost of participation, even in its final act, has outpaced the ability of many to pay. This is not about irresponsibility or a lack of familial love. It is about simple, brutal math. It's a quiet testament to the fact that when a family is forced to choose between paying rent to keep a roof over the heads of their living children and paying for a funeral for a parent they have lost, they are put in an unbearable position. The choice is agonizing, and it is a choice that more and more people are being forced to make. The bodies piling up in our morgues are, in essence, economic refugees. They are casualties of a system where the safety nets have been frayed to the point of breaking. They represent the final tragic outcome of a society where economic inequality has become so profound that it follows us beyond the grave, dictating the very nature of our final rest. This overload, then, is more than a logistical problem for coroners. It is a profound social barometer, a measure of our collective well-being, and it forces us to ask, what exactly makes up that final bill that proves so insurmountable for so many? If the need for a dignified farewell is so fundamental, and the human cost of delaying it is so high, we must understand the anatomy of the price tag itself. We need to look, piece by piece, at the components of a modern funeral to see how the costs accumulate and to understand why an act of remembrance has become one of the most significant and financially crippling purchases a family will ever have to make. To understand why so many are caught in this long, agonizing wait, we must do something that feels almost taboo in a time of grief. We must look squarely at the invoice. We must dissect the anatomy of a modern funeral bill, piece by piece, to see how an act of love and remembrance is transformed into a staggering financial burden. When a family walks into a funeral home, they are often in a state of shock and sorrow, ill-equipped to navigate what is, for all intents and purposes, a major consumer purchase. The document they are presented with, the general price list, is mandated by federal law to provide transparency, but its contents can be overwhelming. A catalog of services and products whose necessity is difficult to gauge in a moment of profound emotional distress. The very first item, and often the largest single charge, is the non-declinable basic services fee. This is the fundamental cost of engaging the funeral home. It covers the funeral director's expertise and time, the 24/7 availability of their staff, the filing of necessary legal paperwork like the death certificate, and the general overhead of the business, the building itself, the utilities, the insurance, the salaries. Think of it as the entry fee, a charge that applies the moment you decide to use their services, regardless of what kind of ceremony, if any, you choose. This fee alone can range from $2,000 to $4,000, forming a substantial foundation of cost before any tangible goods or specific rituals are even considered. Next on the list comes the choice of a casket. This is perhaps the most emotionally charged decision a family has to make. In many funeral homes, they are led to a showroom, a quiet room lined with options that range from a simple cloth-covered composite wood box to a gleaming, gasket-sealed bronze or copper masterpiece. The price range is vast, stretching from under $1,000 to well over $20,000. Here, the pressure to do right by the deceased is immense. The choice can feel like a final public statement about the value of the life that was lived, or the depth of the family's love. A simple, affordable option might feel inadequate, even disrespectful, in the face of grief. It is a moment of profound vulnerability, where the lines between love and commerce become painfully blurred, and costs can escalate rapidly based on a decision made from the heart, not the head. Then, we move from the funeral home to the cemetery, which is almost always a separate business with its own set of costs. First, there is the burial plot itself, the small piece of land that will serve as a final resting place. The price of this land varies dramatically based on location, much like any other real estate. A plot in a dense urban cemetery will cost far more than one in a rural area. even within a single cemetery, prices can differ based on desirability. A spot under a shady oak tree is more expensive than one by a maintenance shed. But the cost of the plot is just the beginning. The majority of modern cemeteries require the purchase of a burial vault or grave liner. This is a heavy, sealed outer container, typically made of concrete, that the casket is placed into. Its purpose is not, as many believe, to protect the body, but rather to protect the cemetery grounds by preventing the earth from collapsing as the casket deteriorates over time. This requirement, which is a cemetery policy rather than a law, adds another one to $2,000 to the total bill. Beyond these major expenses, there is a cascade of smaller, though significant costs. Embalming is a common one. This is the process of temporarily preserving and restoring the body, primarily for the purpose of a public viewing or an open casket funeral. While it is often presented as a standard procedure, it is crucial to know that embalming is not required by law in almost any circumstance. It is a choice, one that adds several hundred to over $1,000 to the bill. Then there are the service fees for each event, a charge for the viewing or visitation, another for the funeral ceremony itself, and yet another for the graveside service. Transportation is itemized, a fee for the hearse to carry the deceased, and perhaps for a flower car. Printed materials like memorial cards and a guest book, the placement of an obituary in a newspaper, and even the honorarium for a clergy member or celebrant all contribute to the growing total. And we haven't even touched upon the headstone or grave marker, a final, necessary expense that can cost anywhere from a few hundred to many thousands of dollars, and is often purchased months later, adding another financial hurdle long after the funeral is over. When you add it all up, the median cost of a funeral with a viewing and burial in the United States now hovers around $10,000. In some regions, it is significantly higher. Now, place that number, $10,000, next to another equally stark figure, the median household savings. As we noted, a significant portion of the population has less than $1,000 saved for an emergency. The gap between the cost of a typical farewell and what an average family has on hand is not a gap at all. It is a chasm. It is the very chasm into which these families fall, leading to the long wait in the county morgue. It is the mathematical certainty behind this quiet, unfolding crisis. The final bill is not just a list of services. It is a reflection of a commercialized system that has evolved over time. And it begs the question, how did we get here? How did an elemental human ritual of grieving and farewell transform into one of the most complex and expensive transactions a family will ever face? The $10,000 funeral, with its itemized list of professional services, embalming, and manufactured goods, feels so deeply ingrained in our cultural landscape that we often assume it has always been this way. But it has not. The journey from a simple, family-led ritual to a multi-billion-dollar commercial enterprise is a uniquely American story, one that begins in the muddy, blood-soaked fields of the Civil War. Before this cataclysmic conflict, the care of the dead was almost universally a domestic, community affair. When a person died, they died at home. The family, typically the women of the household, would wash and dress the body. A local carpenter would be called upon to build a simple wooden coffin. The deceased would be laid out in the parlor of the family home for a period of a day or two, a practice known as the wake. This was a time for neighbors, friends, and relatives to come and pay their respects, to sit with the grieving family, to share food, stories, and the quiet comfort of their presence. The funeral service itself was often a simple procession from the home to the local churchyard for burial. The entire process was intimate, participatory, and deeply embedded in the fabric of the community. It was a shared social responsibility, not a commercial transaction. The costs were minimal and direct. The wood for the coffin, a shovel for the digging of the grave, a meal for the mourners. Death was a part of life, and its rituals were woven into the familiar spaces of home and neighborhood. The Civil War changed everything. It was the first modern industrial-scale war, and it produced death on an unprecedented scale far from home. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died on battlefields, hundreds or even thousands of miles from their families. For the first time, there arose a widespread, desperate desire to bring the bodies of these fallen sons, husbands, and fathers back home for a proper burial in their native soil. This presented a formidable logistical challenge. How to transport a body over long distances by train in an age before widespread refrigeration without it succumbing to rapid decomposition. The answer came in the form of a nascent, chemically based science, arterial embalming. Surgeons and chemists, many of whom had studied European techniques, began offering their services to the military and to grieving families. They would travel to the battlefields and set up makeshift tents, advertising embalming services to preserve the war dead for their long journey home. This was the birth of the large American funeral industry. Embalming was marketed not just as a practical necessity for transport, but as a sanitary measure to protect the public health, and, most powerfully, as a way to create a more beautiful, peaceful, and lifelike memory picture of the deceased for the final viewing. The image of President Abraham Lincoln's embalmed body, which lay in state and was taken on a long, mournful train tour across the country, did more than anything to legitimize and popularize the practice in the public consciousness. It transformed embalming from a battlefield exigency into an aspirational part of a proper farewell. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, these embalming surgeons began to evolve. They were no longer itinerant practitioners. They established fixed places of business. At first, they were often associated with furniture stores, which already sold coffins, now increasingly being called the more elegant-sounding caskets. They called themselves undertakers, and later, the more professional-sounding funeral directors, or morticians. They began to offer a complete suite of services. Instead of families washing and dressing the body at home, the undertaker would now come and remove the deceased to their own facility, the funeral parlor, or funeral home. This move, from the family parlor to the funeral parlor, was a pivotal shift. It medicalized and professionalized the process of dying. Death was no longer a domestic event to be managed by the family. It was a clinical situation to be handled by a trained, licensed professional in a specialized facility. The funeral home became the central institution in the American way of death. It was the place where the body was prepared, where the viewing was held, and from which the procession to the cemetery would begin. This shift had a profound psychological effect. It created a physical and emotional distance between the family and the body of their loved one. The hands-on, intimate care that had been a central part of the grieving process was now outsourced to a stranger for a fee. With this professionalization came commercialization. The funeral director was now a small business owner, selling not just a service, but a range of products. Caskets became more elaborate and expensive. The concept of the gasketed or sealer casket was introduced, marketed with the appealing but scientifically unfounded claim that it would protect the body from the elements of the earth indefinitely. The entire experience was reframed. It was no longer a simple, community-supported act of grieving. It was now an individual consumer transaction, a final gift that the family purchased for the deceased. The language shifted from one of communal duty to one of consumer choice. The pressure to provide a good funeral became entangled with the pressure to spend money, to select the right casket, the best services. Over the decades, this model became entrenched, solidified by state licensing boards, professional associations, and a powerful industry lobby. The result is the system we have today, a highly professionalized, commercialized industry where the costs are significant and the connection to our older, simpler, community-based traditions has been almost entirely severed. The modern funeral bill is the direct legacy of this 150-year journey, from the home parlor to the funeral parlor. Behind the statistics of the morgue overload and the anatomy of the funeral bill lies the most important part of this story: the human heart. For the families caught in this impossible situation, the inability to lay their loved ones to rest inflicts a profound and complicated emotional wound. It is a state of grief in limbo, a sorrow that is suspended, unable to follow its natural course. When a death occurs, human beings have, for all of our history, relied on a series of rituals to help us navigate the overwhelming landscape of loss. These rituals, the gathering, the viewing, the funeral, the burial or cremation, are not empty gestures. They are the essential psychological tools we have developed to perform a series of crucial tasks. First, they help us confront the reality of the death. Seeing the body, being present at a committal, provides a tangible, undeniable confirmation that the person is physically gone. This confirmation is a critical anchor point for the grieving mind, a necessary starting point for the long, difficult process of accepting the loss. Second, these rituals provide a container for our emotions. They create a specific, sanctioned time and place where it is safe to express the powerful, chaotic feelings of sorrow, anger, and despair. The funeral is a space where tears are not only permitted, but expected, where the community gathers to hold that grief collectively, lessening the burden on any single individual. Finally, these rituals mark a transition. They are a rite of passage that moves the deceased from a physical presence in the community to a place in memory, and they begin the living's journey into a new reality, a life that must now be lived without the person who has died. When a family is unable to perform these rituals, every one of these essential psychological functions is disrupted. The grief process is effectively stalled at the very first step. The reality of the death feels incomplete, provisional. How can you fully accept that someone is gone when their body is still physically present, held in a building just a few miles away? The mind remains in a state of suspended disbelief. The loved one is neither fully here nor truly gone. This ambiguity creates a persistent, low-grade state of anxiety and emotional exhaustion. This state is a recognized psychological condition known as complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder. It occurs when the acute phase of mourning becomes stuck, preventing a person from adapting to the loss. The inability to hold a funeral is a direct pathway to this condition. The normal feelings of sadness become chronic, debilitating. There is a sense of being trapped, of life being on hold until this final, necessary task can be completed. This unresolved state can manifest in many ways. Persistent, intrusive thoughts, a deep and unshakable yearning for the deceased, difficulty engaging with daily life, and a profound sense of isolation. The world moves on, but for the family in limbo, time has stopped. The personal anecdotes from those who have lived through this are heartbreakingly consistent. We hear stories of people driving past the county morgue on their way to work each day, overcome with a fresh wave of guilt and sorrow, feeling as though they are abandoning their parent or partner. We hear from individuals who stop answering their phones, terrified it might be a call from the coroner's office with an ultimatum, or from a well-meaning relative asking, "So, when is the funeral?" The shame is a heavy, suffocating blanket. In a society that equates spending with love, the inability to afford a funeral can feel like a profound personal failure, a public declaration that you did not love the person enough. This feeling is, of course, entirely irrational. It is a product of economic hardship, not a lack of love. But in the depths of grief, such logic offers little comfort. Families are forced into desperate measures. They start GoFundMe campaigns, publicly broadcasting their private pain and financial vulnerability to their social networks, hoping for the kindness of strangers. This act of asking for help can be deeply humiliating, layering another level of stress onto an already unbearable situation. Others take on predatory, high-interest loans, starting their new life without their loved one by shackling themselves to years of debt. They sell cherished possessions. They borrow from anyone who will lend. They drain what little retirement or college savings they might have had. The funeral, which should be a time of communal support and healing, becomes a solitary, frantic, and often destructive financial struggle. The isolation is perhaps the cruelest part. Because there is no funeral, there is no single event to rally the community. The support network that would normally activate, friends bringing food, colleagues sending flowers, relatives traveling to be present, never fully mobilizes. The family is left to navigate their sorrow, largely alone, in silence. Their grief has no public witness, no shared outlet. It becomes a private burden, carried in the quiet of their homes. This is the profound, unseen human cost of the long wait. It is more than a delay. It is a fundamental disruption of one of the most essential human processes. It is a denial of closure, a roadblock to healing, and a source of deep, lasting psychological trauma. While the bodies wait in the cold, the living are left in a desolate, frozen landscape of their own, waiting for a thaw that may never come. While families grapple with grief in limbo, another group of people bears the direct, daily weight of this crisis. The public servants who work within the walls of our nation's morgues. These are the custodians of the dead, The medical examiners, forensic pathologists, morgue technicians, and administrative staff who have become the default caretakers for a growing population of the deceased. Their work, already demanding and emotionally taxing, is being fundamentally altered by the sheer volume and duration of the long wait. To understand this, we need to step inside their world and witness a day in the life of a system under immense strain. The day often begins not with a scalpel, but with a spreadsheet. Before any autopsies or examinations can start, the staff must confront the overwhelming logistics of overcapacity. The primary task is a grim form of inventory management, tracking who is here, how long they have been here, and what their status is. Each individual represents a complex case file, a story of outreach to family, of conversations with funeral homes, and often of dead ends. The physical space itself is a constant pressing concern. A morgue is designed with a specific capacity in mind, a number based on historical death rates and average turnover. When that capacity is exceeded, a cascade of difficult decisions begins. Technicians might have to strategically rearrange coolers, consolidating smaller gurneys to make room for one more. They may have to utilize hallways or temporary storage areas that were never intended for the long-term housing of the deceased. The arrival of those refrigerated trailers, which we mentioned earlier, is a sign of a system in deep distress. While they provide a practical solution for overflow, they also carry a heavy psychological toll on the staff. These trailers are symbols of disaster associated with mass casualty events. To see them parked outside your workplace day after day is a constant, stark reminder that the system is failing, that the quiet crisis has become a state of permanent emergency. Beyond the logistics, there is the profound ethical and emotional burden. These public servants are scientists and civil servants, trained to approach their work with a degree of clinical detachment necessary for objectivity and accuracy. But they are also human beings. They did not enter this profession to become long-term guardians of the dead. Yet that is the role they are increasingly forced to play. They see the same names on the cooler doors for months on end. They speak with the same distressed family members week after week, hearing the same stories of financial hardship, the same pleas for just a little more time. They become reluctant witnesses to the intimate struggles of families they will never meet. This creates a unique and difficult form of emotional labor. They must balance compassion for the grieving with their duty to manage a public facility with finite resources. They are caught in the middle, absorbing the sorrow of the families and the pressures of a strained bureaucracy. There is a deep, unspoken sense of responsibility that develops. The staff often knows more about these individuals than anyone else in the final months of their stasis. They know their names, their stories, their families' struggles. A quiet, professional, yet deeply human connection is formed. The deceased are not just case numbers. They become, in a sense, their people. This makes the eventual, often inevitable, outcome all the more difficult. When a family is finally forced to give up, to surrender their loved one to the state for a pauper's burial, the staff feels the loss of that battle keenly. They have been rooting for the family, hoping for a different ending. The final transfer to a common grave can feel like a personal and collective failure. The practical challenges extend beyond just space. The cost of long-term preservation is a significant drain on already tight public budgets. The energy required to run massive refrigeration units 24/7 is substantial. The administrative hours spent on these long-term cases are hours that cannot be spent on other critical tasks. It's an administrative nightmare, a slow-moving avalanche of paperwork that clogs the arteries of the entire system. Each case requires meticulous documentation, legal notifications, and a long, frustrating process of confirming that every possible effort has been made to contact next of kin and facilitate a private disposition. This is a hidden form of public service, one that is almost entirely invisible to the taxpayers who fund it. We see the police, the firefighters, the paramedics. We do not see the morgue technician carefully tending to the deceased who have been in their care for 6 months, ensuring their dignity is maintained even in this prolonged state of waiting. We do not see the administrator on the phone, gently explaining the process of declaring indigence to a weeping daughter who has exhausted every other option. These are the forgotten first responders of our economic crisis. They are working at the final, quiet intersection of social inequality and mortality, and they are doing so with professionalism and compassion, but also under a level of strain that is becoming unsustainable. Their work is a testament to our shared humanity, but the conditions under which they are forced to perform it are a damning indictment of our societal priorities. When the long wait finally comes to an end, not with a family funeral, but with a surrender to the state, it marks a profound and painful transition. For a family that has fought for months, exhausting every financial and emotional resource, this final act is a moment of quiet devastation. The process is known formally as declaring indigence. It is a legal admission that one is utterly without the means to provide a funeral for their next of kin. This isn't a simple form to be filled out. It's often a deeply bureaucratic and sometimes humiliating process. Families may be required to provide extensive financial documentation, bank statements, pay stubs, tax returns, to prove their poverty to the county or state. They must lay bare their financial struggles to a government agency in order to be relieved of a responsibility they desperately wish they could fulfill. It is the final, crushing admission of defeat. Once a body is officially surrendered, it is released from the limbo of the morgue and enters a different, even more anonymous system. It becomes the property and responsibility of the state. The family relinquishes all legal rights to make decisions about the final disposition. They give up the right to choose between burial and cremation, the right to decide where the final resting place will be, and the right to hold any kind of ceremony. They are, in essence, entrusting the final act of care to a bureaucracy that is designed for efficiency and cost-effectiveness, not for personal remembrance or spiritual comfort. The body of the person they loved becomes part of a batch, a number in a system designed to handle the disposition of the unclaimed and the indigent as unobtrusively and inexpensively as possible. The state-sponsored disposition typically follows one of two paths. The most common, especially in dense urban areas, is anonymous cremation. The body is transported from the county morgue to a contracted crematorium. There, it is cremated, often alongside others in a similar situation. The cremated remains, the ashes, are then either placed in a communal repository or in many cases, scattered in a designated unmarked area, such as a plot of land owned by the county or sometimes even at sea. There is no individual marker, no name, no date. The physical remains of the individual are returned to the elements without ceremony and without a specific, identifiable location. For the family, this means there is no grave to visit, no headstone to touch, no physical place in the world to anchor their memory and their grief. The person simply vanishes. The other path is burial in what is historically known as a potter's field. This term comes from a passage in the Bible describing a field bought with the 30 pieces of silver returned by Judas, which was then used to bury strangers and the poor. Today, a potter's field is a section of a public cemetery or a separate cemetery altogether, reserved for state-sponsored burials. Here, the deceased are typically buried in simple, unadorned containers, sometimes in individual plots, but often in long common trenches. In some cities, like New York, whose Hart Island is the largest potter's field in the country, the burials are carried out by inmates from the local jail. The graves are marked not with names, but with small, numbered concrete posts. A single grave might contain multiple individuals. While records are kept, the place itself is one of profound anonymity. It is a landscape of erasure, a final resting place for those whom the economic system has left behind. The loss of ritual in this process is absolute. There is no eulogy, no gathering of friends and family, no shared stories, no music, no flowers. The quiet personal moments that make a funeral a meaningful rite of passage are entirely absent. The committal is a logistical procedure, not a sacred act. This absence of ritual has a devastating effect on the grieving process. It denies the family the closure and the community support that are so essential for healing. The death is not marked, it is disposed of. This leaves a deep, ambiguous scar. The family knows their loved one has been buried or cremated, but the experience is abstract, disconnected. They were not there. They did not witness it. They have no physical proof of it. This can lead to a lifetime of unresolved grief, a nagging sense of incompletion, and a feeling of having failed their loved one at the most critical moment. Surrendering a body to the state is more than just a financial transaction. It is a profound act of social and personal erasure. It severs the final link in a chain of memory that stretches back through human history. For millennia, our burial practices have been about one thing above all else: remembrance. We mark graves, we build monuments, we tell stories, all in an effort to ensure that a life is not forgotten. The potter's field and the anonymous cremation are the antithesis of this human impulse. They represent the moment when a person's individual story is subsumed into the anonymity of the state. It is the ultimate consequence of a system where the dignity of a farewell is not a universal right, but a commodity that must be purchased. And for those who cannot afford the price, the cost is the loss of memory itself. In our exploration of this crisis, it can be easy to cast the funeral director as a simple antagonist, the face of a cold commercial system profiting from grief. But the reality, as is so often the case, is far more nuanced. To truly understand the business of death, we must step inside the funeral home and see the world from the perspective of those who run it. Many funeral directors enter the profession not out of a desire for profit, but from a genuine calling to serve their communities during their most difficult times. They see themselves as caregivers, as facilitators of important rituals, and as stewards of a sacred public trust. And yet, they are also business owners caught in a complex web of economic pressures that contribute directly to the high costs that families face. First and foremost, a funeral home is an incredibly expensive business to operate. The largest factor is the immense overhead. Unlike many businesses, a funeral home must be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Death does not keep business hours. This requires a full staff on call at all times, ready to respond to a call from a hospital, a nursing home, or a private residence at a moment's notice. The physical facility itself is a specialized and costly piece of real estate. It must be large enough to accommodate chapels for services, visitation rooms, arrangement offices, and, crucially, a preparation room that meets stringent health and safety regulations. These buildings are often large, stately, and located in prime commercial areas, which means high property taxes, significant utility bills for heating, cooling, and lighting, and constant maintenance costs. Then there is the fleet of specialized vehicles. A hearse, for example, is not simply a car. It's a custom-built vehicle that can cost well over $100,000. Add to that the limousines for the family, the flower cars, and the first call vehicles used for removals, and the investment in transportation alone is substantial. Regulatory compliance is another significant and often hidden cost. The funeral industry is heavily regulated at both the state and federal levels. There are strict laws governing everything from the handling and transportation of human remains to the way prices are presented to consumers. Staff must undergo extensive training and be licensed by the state, which requires ongoing education and fees. The preparation room must adhere to OSHA standards for workplace safety, involving specialized ventilation systems, protective equipment, and specific protocols for handling chemicals like formaldehyde. All of this compliance adds layers of administrative work and direct cost to the operation. Compounding these inherent costs is a fundamental shift that has been happening within the industry itself over the past few decades. Consolidation. The iconic image of the small, family-owned funeral home, passed down through generations, is rapidly becoming a thing of the past. Large, publicly traded corporations have been steadily acquiring these smaller, independent homes across the country. Companies like Service Corporation International, or SCI, now own thousands of funeral homes and cemeteries, though they often retain the original family name on the sign out front to maintain the illusion of local ownership. This consolidation changes the economic dynamics of the business. A large corporation has obligations not just to the families it serves, but to its shareholders. The primary goal becomes maximizing profit and delivering returns on investment. This can lead to the standardization of services and products, an emphasis on upselling higher margin items like expensive caskets and burial vaults, and the implementation of sales targets and commission-based incentives for staff. The focus can subtly shift from compassionate care to revenue generation. While many of the funeral directors working within these corporate structures remain dedicated professionals, they are operating within a system that prioritizes financial performance, which inevitably puts upward pressure on prices. This creates the central, inherent tension of the modern funeral industry. It is a business that sells a deeply emotional and spiritual service, but it must do so within a capitalist framework. The funeral director is often caught in the middle of this tension. They may genuinely want to help a family that is struggling financially, but they also have a payroll to meet, a mortgage on the building to pay, and their own family to support. They cannot simply give their services away and remain in business. Many funeral homes do, in fact, absorb thousands of dollars in unpaid bills each year from families who are unable to pay, and they often provide services at a reduced cost to indigent families as a community service. But there is a limit to how much of this they can do before their own business becomes unsustainable. The rising costs, from this perspective, are not a result of simple greed, but a reflection of a high overhead, high regulation, 24/7 service industry that is also undergoing a major corporate transformation. The system is structured in a way that makes a $10,000 funeral the logical outcome. This is not to absolve the industry of its responsibility to be transparent and compassionate, but it is to say that the problem is systemic. The funeral director is often as trapped by the economic model as the families they serve. It is a model that places an immense financial burden on the bereaved, a model that feels increasingly out of step with the economic realities of modern life, and it stands in stark contrast to the way that other cultures, and indeed our own ancestors, have approached the final farewell. The high-cost, individualized, and commercialized Western funeral model can feel so inevitable, so fundamentally a part of the landscape of death, that it is hard to imagine any other way. But for the vast majority of human beings on this planet, both today and throughout history, the American way of death would be utterly unrecognizable. By looking at a world of different farewells, at other cultural and spiritual traditions, we can begin to see that our current crisis is not a universal human problem, but a specific, culturally created one. We can see that death does not have to be a crippling financial burden, and that a farewell can be profound, dignified, and deeply meaningful without a $10,000 price tag. Let us consider, for example, the practices within traditional Judaism. When a death occurs, the focus is on simplicity, speed, and community. The body is prepared not by a professional embalmer, but by the Shevra Kadisha, the Sacred Burial Society. These are volunteers from the community, men for male deceased and women for female deceased, who perform the tahara, the ritual washing and purification of the body. This is seen not as a technical task, but as a final act of profound respect and loving kindness, a sacred duty performed without charge. The deceased is then dressed in simple, hand-sewn white linen shrouds known as tachrishim. This tradition is egalitarian. Every person, from the wealthiest scholar to the poorest laborer, is buried in the same simple garments, symbolizing that all are equal before God in death. The coffin, or aron, is also mandated to be simple. It must be made entirely of wood, with no metal parts, and often has holes drilled in the bottom to hasten the body's natural return to the earth, fulfilling the biblical injunction, "For dust you are, and to dust you shall return." The funeral and burial happen quickly, ideally within 24 hours of death. The community gathers, prayers are said, and the family and friends themselves participate in the burial, taking turns shoveling earth into the grave until it is filled. This physical act of participation is considered a great mitzvah, a commandment and a good deed. The entire process is centered on community support, spiritual necessity, and a radical simplicity that stands in stark opposition to the elaborate, costly choices of the American model. Similarly, in Islamic tradition, the principles of simplicity and immediacy are paramount. The body is ritually washed, again by family and community members of the same gender, and then wrapped in a simple white cloth, the kafan. Embalming is forbidden, as it is seen as a desecration of the body, and elaborate, expensive caskets are strongly discouraged. The focus is on a swift and humble return to God. The funeral prayer, the Salat al-Janazah, is performed often at the mosque, and the body is taken to the cemetery for burial, again, as quickly as possible. The community's role is central. It is considered a collective obligation, a fard kifaya, for the community to ensure that every Muslim receives a proper burial, regardless of their financial status. The costs are kept to an absolute minimum, often covered by the mosque or by collections from the community. The idea that a family would go into debt for a funeral is completely alien to this worldview. We can also look to the diverse traditions of Hinduism, where cremation is the customary practice. The body is typically cremated on an open-air pyre, often on the banks of a sacred river like the Ganges. The rituals surrounding the death are complex and deeply symbolic, but the material costs are relatively low. The focus is not on the preservation of the physical body, which is seen as a temporary vessel for the eternal soul, or Atman, but on the rituals that will ensure the soul's smooth transition to its next incarnation. The family and community are deeply involved in every step of the process, from preparing the body to lighting the pyre. The ceremony is about spiritual passage, not material display. What do all of these diverse traditions have in common? Several key things. First, the care of the dead is a hands-on, participatory activity for the family and the community, not a service outsourced to paid professionals. This direct involvement is a crucial part of the grieving process. Second, they emphasize simplicity and humility in the face of death. Material wealth and status are rendered meaningless, and the focus is on spiritual values. Third, the community bears a collective responsibility for ensuring a dignified farewell for all its members. It is a social duty, not an individual financial burden. By contrasting these models with our own, the unique and problematic nature of the Western system comes into sharp relief. We have professionalized and commercialized a process that, for most of the world, remains a sacred community obligation. We have created a system that encourages elaborate material display as a proxy for love and respect. We have individualized the financial burden, placing it squarely on the shoulders of the grieving family at their most vulnerable moment. This comparison is not about judging our system as wrong and others as right. It is about opening our eyes to the possibility that other ways exist. It shows us that the financial crisis we are facing in our morgues and funeral homes is not an unavoidable fact of life and death. It is the result of a series of cultural and commercial choices we have made over the last century and a half. And if we made those choices, it means we have the power to make new ones. When a family finds themselves trapped in the chasm between the cost of a funeral and their available resources, a secondary, often predatory, ecosystem emerges to meet them in their moment of desperation. This is the world of funeral financing, an industry that exists at the painful intersection of grief and debt. Unable to pay the $10,000 bill up front, families are often presented with what seem like solutions, but which can quickly spiral into long-term financial nightmares. Breaking the cycle of debt for one generation by ensuring it begins for the next. The most immediate and common of these are funeral loans, financial products specifically designed and marketed for this unique, high-stress situation. These loans are often offered through third-party lenders who partner with funeral homes. While they provide immediate access to the necessary cash, allowing the funeral to proceed, they frequently come with dangerously high interest rates. Because the borrowers are in a state of emotional distress and under extreme time pressure, they are not in a position to shop around for competitive rates or carefully scrutinize the terms and conditions. Lenders know this. The underwriting standards can be less stringent than for a traditional personal loan, but the cost of that accessibility is an interest rate that can sometimes rival that of a credit card. A $10,000 funeral can quickly become a $12,000, $13,000, or even $15,000 debt by the time it is paid off years later. The monthly payments become a constant, painful reminder of the loss, a financial ghost that haunts the family budget long after the flowers have wilted. Another financial product that targets grieving families is the assignment of an insurance policy. If the deceased had a life insurance policy, a family can sometimes sign over the rights to the payout directly to the funeral home to cover the costs. On the surface, this seems like a sensible and efficient solution. However, it can be fraught with complications. The process can be slow, and some funeral homes may charge an additional fee for the convenience of handling the paperwork and for waiting to be paid by the insurance company. More insidiously, when a family signs over the entire policy, they may not be aware of the exact final cost of the funeral. This can create a situation where a $30,000 insurance policy intended to provide the surviving spouse with a financial cushion for the future is entirely consumed by a funeral, with any remaining balance absorbed by the funeral home in vaguely defined fees. The legacy of care the deceased intended to leave behind is instead diverted to pay for their departure. Beyond loans and insurance assignments, there are other, even more questionable practices. Some families are encouraged to put the entire cost on high-interest credit cards, splitting the bill across several cards if necessary. This is perhaps the most financially damaging path, as consumer credit card interest rates can be exorbitant, quickly trapping a family in a cycle of minimum payments that barely touch the principal. In some cases, funeral homes have even been known to place a lien on the deceased's property, such as a house, as collateral for the funeral bill, putting the family's primary asset at risk. These practices, while not always illegal, prey on the unique vulnerability of the bereaved. The normal consumer safeguards, time for research, the ability to walk away, a clear state of mind, are all absent in the funeral arrangement room. The long-term consequences of this debt are profound. For a family already living on the financial edge, adding a monthly funeral loan payment can be the straw that breaks the camel's back. It can mean forgoing other necessities, falling behind on rent or mortgage payments, or being unable to save for their children's education or their own retirement. It perpetuates a cycle of poverty. The wealth that might have been passed down from one generation to the next, however small, is instead extracted from the family at the moment of death. The economic blow of losing a loved one, especially if they were a primary breadwinner, is compounded by the crippling cost of their farewell. What makes this situation even more tragic is the almost complete lack of a systemic safety net. In the United States, there is no comprehensive federal program to assist low-income families with funeral expenses. The responsibility is left to a patchwork of inconsistent and severely underfunded state and county programs. A family might be able to apply for a few $100s from a county indigent burial fund, but this amount is a drop in the bucket compared to the total cost. It might cover the cost of a basic cremation, but it will not provide for any kind of memorial service or gathering. Social Security offers a one-time lump sum death payment of a mere $255, a figure that has not been adjusted for inflation since it was set in the 1950s. It is a cruelly inadequate gesture. This lack of systemic support is what creates the vacuum that predatory financial products rush in to fill. The state effectively offers two stark choices: take on crippling debt to have a private, meaningful funeral, or surrender your loved one to an anonymous, state-sponsored disposition. There is very little middle ground. The system leaves families to fend for themselves, to navigate a complex and expensive commercial transaction at the worst possible moment of their lives, with almost no public assistance. This is the financial reality that underpins the long wait in the morgue. It is a system that seems almost perfectly designed to turn grief into debt, and to ensure that for the most vulnerable among us, the final farewell is not a source of comfort, but a source of lasting financial ruin. In the face of this overwhelming system of high costs and mounting debt, a quiet revolution has taken place. Pushed by economic necessity and pulled by a desire for more personal and meaningful farewells, a growing number of people are turning away from the traditional funeral home model and embracing simpler, more affordable, and often more environmentally conscious alternatives. This is not about rejecting tradition, but about reclaiming it, about finding new and old ways to say goodbye that align more closely with both their values and their budgets. The most significant and fastest growing of these alternatives is a practice known as direct cremation. Direct cremation is exactly what it sounds like. It is the simplest possible disposition. When a death occurs, a cremation provider is called. They transport the body from the place of death directly to the crematorium. There is no embalming, no viewing, no visitation, and no funeral service at a funeral home. The body is placed in a simple, combustible container, cremated, and the ashes are returned to the family, usually within a few days, in a basic container. The cost for this service is a fraction of a traditional funeral, often ranging from under $1,000 to around $2,000. This radical reduction in price is achieved by unbundling the disposition of the body from the memorial service. By choosing direct cremation, a family separates the practical task of dealing with the physical remains from the emotional and spiritual task of honoring the life. This separation is key. It frees the family from the immense time pressure and financial pressure of the traditional model. With the ashes in their possession, they can plan a memorial service at their own pace. It can be held a week, a month, or even a year later, at a time and place that is meaningful to them. It could be a gathering in a family home, a service in a park, a celebration of life at a favorite restaurant, or a scattering ceremony at a beloved natural spot. The memorial is no longer tied to the expensive infrastructure of a funeral home chapel. This not only saves an enormous amount of money, but it also allows for a level of personalization and creativity that is often difficult to achieve within the confines of a traditional service. It puts the power and the meaning-making back into the hands of the family. Alongside the rise of direct cremation, we are also seeing a re-emergence of an even older tradition, the home funeral. This is a return to the way our ancestors cared for their dead for centuries. With a home funeral, the family, with the guidance of a death doula or a home funeral guide, takes the lead in caring for their own deceased. They may wash and dress the body at home, using simple, non-invasive cooling techniques like dry ice to keep the body cool for a period of 1 to 3 days. This allows for an extended, private, and intimate wake in the familiar comfort of the family home. Friends and family can come and go, spending quiet time with the deceased, sharing stories, and beginning their grieving process in a gentle, unhurried way. It is a profoundly empowering and healing experience for many, transforming them from passive consumers of a funeral service into active participants in the final act of care. It is important to note that keeping a body at home for a short period is legal in almost every state. The home funeral movement is about educating people about their rights and providing them with the knowledge and support to reclaim this ancient practice. It is the ultimate rejection of the commercialization of death, a powerful statement that the care of a loved one is not a service to be bought, but a final, sacred act of love. Another growing movement is that of green or natural burial. This is a return to the simple, earth-friendly burial practices of the past. Green burial seeks to minimize environmental impact. This means no embalming with toxic chemicals, no concrete burial vaults, and no elaborate hardwood or metal caskets. Instead, the body is wrapped in a simple, biodegradable shroud or placed in a plain pine or wicker casket. The grave is dug only to the depth necessary for natural decomposition, allowing the body to truly return to the earth, to nourish the soil and the plant life above. Green cemeteries are often beautiful, natural landscapes, more like nature preserves than manicured memorial parks, with graves marked by a simple fieldstone, a native plant, or recorded only by GPS coordinates. This option appeals not only for its lower environmental impact and often lower cost, but also for its powerful, life-affirming philosophy of accepting the body's place in the natural cycle of decay and renewal. Finally, technology is also playing a role in creating new forms of remembrance. The pandemic accelerated the adoption of virtual or live stream funeral services, allowing people from all over the world to participate in a memorial, removing the financial and logistical barriers of travel. Online memorial pages have become digital gathering places, repositories of photos, stories, and condolences that can be accessed anytime, anywhere. These digital forms of memorialization do not replace the need for physical gathering, but they can supplement it, creating a more inclusive and lasting tapestry of memory. All of these rising alternatives, direct cremation, home funerals, green burial, and digital memorials, share a common thread. They are all expressions of a desire to find a more authentic, affordable, and personal way to navigate one of life's most profound experiences. They are challenging the monolithic, one-size-fits-all model that has dominated for the past century, and in doing so, they are slowly but surely changing our cultural conversation about what it means to say a good goodbye. To truly understand the human impact of these diverging paths, let us walk alongside two families as they navigate the landscape of loss, each making a different set of choices that will shape not only their farewells, but their futures. This is a tale of two funerals, a comparative story that illustrates the profound emotional and financial consequences of the choices we are forced to make in the face of death. Our first story is that of the Garcia family. When Maria Garcia, the beloved matriarch of the family, passed away suddenly from a heart attack, her 3 adult children were thrown into a state of shock and confusion. Maria had been a traditional woman, a devout Catholic who had attended funerals at the same local, family-owned funeral home her entire life. For her children, there was no question about what to do. The unspoken assumption was that they would give their mother the proper funeral she deserved, the same kind of funeral she had attended for so many others. They went to the funeral home, a stately brick building they had driven past 1,000 times. The funeral director was kind, compassionate, and spoke in soft, reassuring tones. He guided them through the process, presenting them with a range of options. Overwhelmed by grief and wanting to honor their mother's memory in the best way they knew how, they agreed to everything that was presented as standard. They chose a beautiful, modest but still costly cherry wood casket because the cheaper ones felt undignified. They agreed to embalming for the open casket viewing, wanting to see their mother looking peaceful one last time. They scheduled a 2-day visitation, a funeral mass at their parish, and a procession to the cemetery, where Maria would be buried next to her late husband. The funeral director presented them with the estimated bill, just over $12,000. A wave of panic washed over the siblings. Their mother had left no life insurance and had only a few $100s in a savings account. Between the 3 of them, they could only scrape together about $3,000. The funeral director, seeing their distress, helpfully suggested a financing plan through a third-party lender. Feeling they had no other choice, and with the pressure of time mounting, they signed the loan paperwork. The funeral was beautiful. The church was full. The eulogies were heartfelt, and the community gathered to support them. For a few days, they felt a sense of comfort and closure. But then, the first loan payment arrived. For the next 5 years, each of the siblings would have to pay $200 a month. This new expense was a constant strain. For the youngest son, it meant putting off his dream of going back to school. For the daughter, it meant cutting back on her own children's extracurricular activities. every month, the payment was a painful reminder of not just their mother's death, but of the debt they had taken on in her name. The beautiful memory of the funeral became intertwined with a quiet, persistent resentment and financial anxiety. The community support they felt during the service faded, but the debt remained, a private burden that frayed their relationships and shadowed their futures. Now let us consider a different story, that of the Chen family. When David Chen died after a long battle with cancer, his wife, Sarah, and their 2 grown children were heartbroken, but not unprepared. David had been a pragmatic and unsentimental man, an avid hiker who loved the outdoors. He had been clear about his wishes. He wanted no fuss, no expensive casket, and he certainly did not want his family to go into debt. He wanted to be cremated, and he wanted his ashes scattered on his favorite hiking trail in the mountains. After his death, Sarah called a local, low-cost direct cremation provider that she had researched online. Their price was a flat fee of $1,200. A few days later, a staff member delivered David's ashes to their home in a simple, respectful wooden box. With the immediate pressure of dealing with their father's body resolved, the family could breathe. They decided to hold a memorial for David a month later, on a Saturday when relatives from out of town could travel. They rented a small, beautiful pavilion in the state park where David had loved to hike. They invited friends and family, asking everyone to bring a memory to share instead of flowers. They created a simple slideshow of photos that played on a laptop. They played his favorite folk music from a small Bluetooth speaker. His son spoke about their hiking trips together, and his daughter read a poem he had loved. Afterward, they shared a simple potluck meal, telling stories and laughing through their tears. The next morning, Sarah and her 2 children made the hike up to David's favorite overlook. There, as the sun rose over the valley, they scattered his ashes, reading a final blessing they had written together. The total cost for everything, the cremation, the pavilion rental, the food, was less than $2,000, which they were able to cover without any financial strain. There was no debt. There was no pressure. The farewell they created was deeply personal, authentic to the man David was, and focused entirely on their memories and their love for him. They were left not with a monthly bill, but with the beautiful, unburdened memory of a day spent in nature, surrounded by love, honoring their husband and father in a way that felt true and right. Their path was not easier in its grief, but it was unburdened by the additional weight of financial crisis, leaving them free to focus on what truly mattered: healing. In the digital age, a new and complex phenomenon has emerged as a direct response to the funeral funding crisis: the crowd-funded funeral. When a family is faced with a bill they cannot pay, one of the first suggestions they often receive from friends, or even from the funeral director, is to start a GoFundMe. In the absence of systemic support, we have turned to the digital collection plate. Platforms like GoFundMe, once primarily used for creative projects or startup businesses, have become a dominant force in the landscape of death care, a last resort for hundreds of thousands of families caught between an unaffordable farewell and an unthinkable surrender to the state. On the surface, the rise of the crowd-funded funeral seems like a heartwarming testament to the power of community and the generosity of the human spirit. And in many individual cases, it is. A successful campaign can feel like a miracle. It is a digital barn raising where a community, both local and virtual, comes together to lift up a family in their time of need. Friends, distant relatives, co-workers, and sometimes even compassionate strangers can contribute small amounts that collectively add up to enough to cover the cost of a cremation or a burial. For a family drowning in grief and financial panic, a flood of donations can feel like a lifeline, a powerful affirmation that they are not alone, that their community cares. It can transform a moment of private despair into an experience of shared support. These campaigns often become living digital memorials. The comments section fills up with condolences, memories, and stories about the deceased, creating a virtual wake that provides real comfort to the grieving family. The act of donating, for many, is a tangible way to express sympathy and to feel that they are doing something concrete to help when they might otherwise feel helpless. In the best-case scenarios, crowdfunding allows a family to provide the dignified farewell they so desperately want for their loved one, bypassing the need for predatory loans and preventing them from falling into a cycle of debt. It is, in these moments, a beautiful example of technology being harnessed for communal good. However, if we step back and look at this phenomenon from a broader, more critical perspective, a much more troubling picture emerges. The reliance on crowdfunding to pay for a basic human necessity, like a dignified burial, raises profound and uncomfortable ethical questions. It effectively shifts the burden of a massive systemic failure onto the shoulders of individuals. It takes what should be a matter of public responsibility and social welfare and transforms it into a matter of private charity. A dignified farewell becomes not a right, but a prize to be won in a lottery of social connection and marketing savvy. The success of a GoFundMe campaign is not determined by the depth of a family's grief or the worthiness of the deceased. It is determined by other, far more arbitrary factors. First and foremost is the size and financial capacity of one's social network. A family with deep roots in a large, affluent community, with hundreds of friends on social media, has a far greater chance of success than an isolated, low-income family whose social circle is composed of people in similarly precarious financial situations. The ability to fundraise becomes a reflection of one's social capital, not one's human need. Second is the family's ability to craft a compelling narrative. To be successful, a campaign requires a story that is tragic, moving, and shareable. Families are forced to become marketers of their own grief, to publicly perform their pain in a way that will elicit sympathy and donations from strangers. They must post appealing photographs, write heart-wrenching text, and provide constant updates to keep the campaign visible in the relentless churn of social media feeds. This is an immense emotional burden to place on people who are already at their breaking point. It turns a private tragedy into public content to be consumed, judged, and, if it is compelling enough, funded. What happens when a campaign goes viral? It's celebrated as a success story. But what about the thousands of campaigns that do not? For every family that reaches its goal, there are countless others who raise only a few $100s, not nearly enough to make a difference, leaving them with not only their original financial problem, but also a fresh sense of public failure and shame. Their inability to afford a funeral is compounded by their inability to successfully crowdfund one. The system creates a stark and cruel divide between the pitiable and the unpitiable poor. Ultimately, the normalization of the crowd-funded funeral allows the larger systems, the government, the funeral industry, the financial sector, to abdicate their responsibility. It creates the illusion that the problem is being solved, one viral campaign at a time, while the underlying structural issues of economic inequality, predatory lending, and the lack of social safety nets go unaddressed. It is a temporary, digital patch on a deep, societal wound. While we can and should celebrate the individual acts of generosity that these platforms enable, we must also be wary of accepting this as a just or sustainable solution. When the basic dignity of a final resting place becomes dependent on your ability to tell a good story and go viral, we have ventured into a profoundly troubling new territory. In the face of a system that often leaves families with the grim choices of debt, charity, or anonymity, a powerful counter-movement is quietly growing. This is the work of activists, advocates, and compassionate professionals who are not content to simply patch the wounds of a broken system. They are actively working to reclaim death care, to create new models, and push for systemic changes that would make a dignified, affordable farewell a genuine right for everyone, not a privilege for the few. This movement is multifaceted, operating on the ground in our communities and in the halls of power, offering both immediate, practical help and a vision for a more just and humane future. At the most grassroots level, we see the rise of community death care advocates. These are often volunteers, hospice workers, social workers, artists, and ordinary citizens who have educated themselves in the practical, legal, and spiritual aspects of end-of-life care. They function as death doulas or end-of-life guides, working directly with families to help them understand their options outside of the traditional funeral home system. They might help a family plan a home funeral, navigate the paperwork for a direct cremation, or organize a meaningful memorial service in a community space. Their work is about demystifying the process of death, returning agency to the family, and reminding us that we, as communities, have the inherent capacity to care for our own. They are the modern incarnation of the Chevra Kadisha, or the neighborhood women who once laid out the dead, rebuilding the web of communal support that has been frayed by a century of commercialization. A small but growing number of nonprofit funeral homes are also challenging the prevailing business model. These organizations, often called funeral consumer alliances or memorial societies, operate with a mission of service rather than profit. They provide simple, low-cost funeral and cremation services at a transparent, at-cost price. Because they are not beholden to shareholders or sales targets, they can focus entirely on providing families with what they need, not what can be upsold. They are champions of price transparency, often publishing their full price lists online so families can compare costs without the pressure of an in-person sales pitch. They are both a practical alternative and a powerful form of advocacy, demonstrating that it is possible to provide compassionate, professional death care without the exorbitant price tag. They are living proof that a different model can work. Beyond these community-based efforts, there is a growing push for meaningful policy solutions at the state and federal levels. One of the most fundamental and achievable goals is mandating universal price transparency. While funeral homes are required by the Federal Trade Commission's Funeral Rule to provide a general price list to anyone who asks for it in person, many are not required to post their prices online. Activists are pushing for legislation that would require all funeral homes to publish their complete price lists on their websites. This simple change would empower consumers to comparison shop easily and discreetly from their own homes, fostering genuine competition and putting downward pressure on prices. It would be a simple, common-sense reform that could save families thousands of dollars. A more ambitious policy solution involves the creation of robust, state-level funeral assistance funds. Instead of the current patchwork of inadequate county programs, advocates envision a system where every state has a well-funded program to provide a basic but dignified funeral or cremation for any resident who cannot afford one. This could be funded through a small fee on every death certificate issued in the state, spreading the cost thinly across the entire population. Such a program would create a genuine safety net, ensuring that the choice is no longer between debt and a potter's field. It would be a declaration that in a compassionate society, no one is left behind, not even in death. Finally, the most powerful tool for reclaiming death care is one that is available to all of us: conversation. The single greatest contributing factor to the funeral crisis is our profound cultural reluctance to talk about death. We avoid the topic, believing it to be morbid or frightening. As a result, most people die without ever having expressed their end-of-life wishes or having made any financial plans for their own disposition. This leaves their grieving families to make difficult, expensive decisions in a state of crisis and ignorance. The most transformative act of activism any of us can undertake is to break this silence. This means having open, honest conversations with our loved ones. What do you want when you die? Do you prefer burial or cremation? Do you want a large, traditional service or a small, private gathering? It means putting these wishes in writing in a clear, legally recognized document. It means pre-planning, not necessarily by prepaying a funeral home, which can be risky, but by researching options, understanding costs, and setting aside dedicated funds in a separate savings account. These conversations are a gift to the people we will leave behind. They lift the burden of guesswork and financial panic from their shoulders, allowing them to grieve without the added trauma of a crisis. By planning ahead, we reclaim control from the industry and ensure our farewell reflects our own values, not a set of commercial pressures. This combination of grassroots action, nonprofit innovation, policy reform, and personal responsibility offers a path forward, a way to mend the broken systems and rebuild a culture where death is met not with financial exploitation, but with community, compassion, and grace. As we arrive at the end of our journey together, we return to the quiet, climate-controlled corridors of the county morgue, to the long, silent wait that began our story. We now understand that the presence of these individuals, held in a state of suspended farewell, is not a simple logistical problem. It is a profound and complex symptom of a much larger story about who we are and what we value. This crisis forces us to look in a mirror and ask the central question once more: what do our burial practices, particularly for the most vulnerable, truly reveal about our society? What can we learn from the silence in these refrigerated rooms? The answer, it seems, is that they reveal a deep and growing fracture. They reveal a society where the bonds of community have been frayed, where the collective responsibility for one another has been replaced by a fierce and often isolating individualism. The transition from the family parlor to the funeral parlor, from the community-dug grave to the corporate-owned cemetery, was more than just a change in logistics. It was a shift in our social contract. We outsourced a sacred duty, and in doing so, we also outsourced a fundamental aspect of our communal heart. The care of the dead, once a central binding ritual for a community, became a private consumer transaction, subject to the same market forces as any other good or service. And like so many other essential aspects of life, healthcare, housing, education, when care is transformed into a commodity, it inevitably becomes inaccessible to those without the means to purchase it. The long wait in the morgue is the logical, heartbreaking endpoint of this transformation. It is a stark manifestation of our economic inequality, a final, posthumous stratification that separates the rich and the poor, even in death. It reveals a world where the ability to mourn publicly, to create a place of memory, to perform the ancient rituals that have guided our species through the darkness of loss, is now contingent on one's credit score. This is a profound and uncomfortable truth. The way we treat our dead is a direct reflection of the way we treat our living. A society that allows its most vulnerable members to be priced out of a dignified farewell is a society that is struggling with its own soul. Yet, amid this somber reflection, there are powerful glimmers of hope. The rise of simpler goodbyes, the re-emergence of home funerals and green burials, the tireless work of death doulas and nonprofit funeral homes. These are not just trends or niche alternatives. They are acts of quiet rebellion. They are a conscious effort to reclaim what has been lost. They represent a deep human yearning to reconnect with the essential, elemental aspects of life and death, to strip away the layers of commercialism and find the meaning that lies beneath. They are a search for authenticity in a system that often feels artificial. This movement suggests that we are beginning to remember something vital, that the most valuable part of a farewell is not what we buy, but what we do. The most profound eulogy is not the one delivered by a paid professional, but the one spoken from the heart by a son or a friend. The most sacred space is not a lavishly decorated chapel, but any space where love and memory are allowed to gather. Perhaps the ultimate lesson from this crisis is that rebuilding a compassionate society requires us to relearn how to care for one another at the bookends of life. We must rebuild the webs of support for the birthing and the dying. This is not a task for the government alone or for nonprofits alone. It is the work of neighbors, of friends, of communities. It means breaking the taboo of silence and talking openly about our wishes and our fears. It means showing up for the grieving, not just with a sympathy card, but with our time, our presence, and our shared vulnerability. It means recognizing that the funeral is not just for the dead, it is for the living. It is the ritual that reaffirms our bonds, that reminds us of our shared mortality, and that stitches the fabric of a community back together after it has been torn by loss. The quiet custodians of the dead in our public morgues will continue their work, holding a space of dignity for those who wait. But their silent vigil is also a challenge to all of us. It asks us if this is the best we can do. It asks us to decide whether a dignified farewell is a luxury product or a fundamental human right. It prompts us to consider how we might begin, in our own lives and in our own communities, to rebuild a culture of care, one where the final act of love is no longer measured by an invoice. The answer will not be found in any single policy or program, but in a million small acts of courage, conversation, and compassion. It will be found when we decide, together, that no one's final journey should have to wait for the money to arrive.